Just kind of giving you a heads up. I just want to kind of start in, I don't know, a not so light and uplifting way, but there's purpose in this, so bear with me. And I don't know why or how this came up in my feed, but apparently recently a man was caught for multiple counts of kidnapping women, and he admitted that on multiple counts for kidnapping women, raping them, and murdering many of them. And again, I'm sorry if this is not the most uplifting way to start a sermon, but I thought it was just such a great way to kind of look into what we're talking about today, because what happened was, I don't know how it came up on my feed, but it was a video clip, and it said it was going to be kind of graphic, and it's just kind of a disclaimer. And I'm watching this, and he admitted to doing all these kinds of terrible things, and he even said that right now there was a young girl who was in captivity, and he told her where she was. And so, it was just like an army of cops just kind of storming into this abandoned place. It's like one of those shipment containers, those huge metal things, just terrible, in the middle of nowhere. And they break in, and you see this, and this is on the video clip, you see this young girl just just held down and enslaved. And she's bound up, she can't do anything. And you see, it's a literal live, not a live footage, but it's a real clip of that happening. And you see the cops coming in and just kind of unbounding her and rescuing her from that. And this is not a movie. This is a real girl. This isn't the movie Taken, where guy comes in and takes on 100 guys by himself, you know what I'm saying? This is like real life stuff. And you see this girl, freed, and they're trying to care for her and all that stuff, and that's where the video clip ends. For us as the viewers, that's where it ends, but for this girl, it's going to be a long, long process of recovery, if you can imagine. You feel me on that, church, because it's like, yes, it's great news that this girl is rescued. I can't imagine, the kind of atrocities this girl must have been through, but she is rescued. And we can immediately kind of dismiss that and say, oh, well then, she's going to ride off into the sunset and she's going to be happy forever. But it's a long, long process. And my guess, and I don't know this for sure, but I'm pretty confident to say that she's going to have to go through some heavy, heavy counseling and therapy. When you're bound, like, I don't know if it was one day, weeks, months, or up to years, I don't know how long, but when you're bound up like that, and things are done to you against your will physically, it's not just a physical thing. It affects you emotionally. It affects you mentally, even spiritually. These are heavy, heavy things that happen. And so my guess is that she's going to have to really go through a long, slow process of learning how to trust men again. And maybe even like her own father or own siblings. A process of learning just how to trust people. We're talking heavy, heavy trust issues here. And we're talking, how is this girl going to go back to the normalities of her life? Things like going back to her family and her friends and her community, because these people know what happened to her. And so what she has to explain her story all over again every time she sees a friend. And not only that, the shame that's involved, because everybody knows that she was raped. Everybody knows that she had things done to her against her own will. And now she has to now publicly go to these people and act like everything's normal, but it's not normal. We're talking deep heart recovery. And we're talking major, major trust issues. And I don't know if this girl was a believer or not. But I can only even imagine, maybe that even affects her spiritually, in that how can she trust God through this process? How could God have let me been captured like that against my own will and those things done to me? If God is real and if God is loving, how could God do something like that to me? And so I don't know how long she was captured for. It could have been one day, it could have been months or years, but I think we can be confident in saying slavery and bondage and oppression have a really deep impact on how you view everything. You cannot simply wake up the next day and go back to life as normal. And so now think with me, church. we're going through Exodus. We're going through this story of God delivering his people. Now, the reason I bring that to your attention is because imagine the kind of recovery, imagine the kind of things that this girl has to go through after she is saved from bondage and slavery. And the question I want you to think about is, what does 400 years of slavery do to a people? We're not talking, I'm not trying to be cavalier with this woman's experience, but imagine if that was a 1 week, couple weeks, months, whatever it was, imagine 400 years of bondage and what that does to you emotionally, what that does to you physically, what that does to you spiritually. And if you can only imagine what that poor girl now has to go through in that recovery process, now imagine what God's people have to go through in their recovery process as they are unlearning what it means to be a slave. If they're now reprogramming and relearning of what it means to be free. 400 years. Okay, that's history. That's a history of slavery. 400 years of slavery doesn't mean you were a slave for fun. That's now your identity. Okay, you were born as a slave, and that's all you know. The idea of freedom is not something you practice. You don't wake up thinking you're a free person. Freedom is a distant and ambiguous concept. Freedom is something you can only dream about. Freedom is only something you can speculate about because you do not know what freedom is. Your identity is in slavery. That is who you are. That's what 400 years does. 400 years of slavery. And so, what is it going to take for the Israelites to understand that they are a free people? What is it actually going to take? What is it going to take for the Israelites to let go of their old identity of slaves and embrace their new identity of God's people? The wilderness. That's what it's going to take. Because God is going to use the wilderness to do a deep, deep work of the heart. That God loves his people so much that he's not just going to deliver them, but he's going to dwell among them. He's going to be amongst them. And he's going to do a deep, deep work in the heart of getting them to understand step by step. And this is kind of God's way of doing therapy, if you will, and his way of getting them to believe you are no longer slaves. And so if you've been tracking with us in Exodus, and I hope you're processing and you're thinking and you're praying and you're applying these major themes in your life, but I'm hoping that you're able to start fitting things together theologically, that you're able to start plugging these major themes and big pictures into your life. And what I mean is, we've talked about the Red Sea. So theologically speaking, or just if this is the Christian life, what is the Red Sea? Well, the Red Sea is salvation. More specifically, justification. The Red Sea is when we talk about, well, Jesus died for my sins and now I can go to heaven. I'm saved. I'm saved. I have salvation. I can now go to heaven and I can go into the promised land. You see, that's kind of our spiritual language, if you will, of what salvation is. The Red Sea is salvation. And so what is the wilderness then? It's this weird thing that comes after salvation. That's what we call sanctification. The wilderness, God's way of doing therapy on us, is sanctification. Becoming more like Jesus, getting into this process of being more like God, right? And that's what the Christian life is. And so, with that said, if the wilderness is sanctification, that means that all believers in this room are in the wilderness right now. That if you are a publicly confessing believer of Jesus Christ, that you are in the wilderness right now. And some of you are in a wilderness within a wilderness. And so we really need to take this wilderness narrative to our hearts. We need to think deeply about what God is communicating to us in his word right now. And so if you're in the thick of the wilderness right now, you're in this process of sanctification, believe it or not, you have a choice. The question is not whether or not you're going to be in the wilderness. You're in the wilderness. You have a choice. And the Israelites have a choice. And what do they choose to do? Go to Exodus 15. I'm going to jump to 3 different texts, and so follow along with me. Exodus 15. What do the Israelites choose to do? In verse 23, when they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. Therefore, it was named Marah. Very complexly written sentence there. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? Exodus 16, verse 2. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, with that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Chapter 17, verse 2. Chapter 17, verse 2. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. And Moses said to them, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? So stop there. I just wanted to point to 3 different texts to show you very apparently, there's nothing tricky here going on. I just wanted to show you that they're grumbling. And grumbling is not just in one little verse, but it's all over the text. And when you remember and you go back to this wilderness narrative, you're going to remember that this is a story of how Israel grumbled. The theme that we're talking about, the big picture is Israel, God has delivered them, and they're grumbling. And I want you to remember that this wilderness story, even though God is being faithful, is they are grumbling and they are complaining. And it's not just grumbling and complaining. This kind of grumbling is more like, it's a conservative word. This idea of grumbling is more like active rebellion. They are choosing, they're willfully, consciously choosing to deny God. It's not just, oh my gosh, I'm hungry. It's not just, oh my gosh, I'm thirsty, I'm uncomfortable. It's a willing, conscious choice to actively rebel against God and say, I don't trust God anymore. You have brought us out into the wilderness. Why? So we can die. And so what we're talking about here is active rebellion. And now, honestly, church, I can stop here and I can just kind of preach at you and say, but you have so much to be thankful for. Count your blessings. Make every day about thanksgiving. And if you do that, you won't grumble anymore. Grumbling and complaining have no part in the Christian life, right? I can push you to that because that'll preach. That's really, really easy to preach. Anybody could come up here and guilt you into saying, what reason do you have to complain and grumble? But that's not what we're going to do. I think there's a lot more depth to this text than just that. And what I mean is, if you can think about what it's like to be an Israelite in the wilderness. And the word that we're going to use here is empathy. If you can empathize with these Israelites. Now, about 23 of us this past weekend, we spent a couple days at a leaders retreat, and our entire focus was on how to care people with the gospel. We devoted 2 days. We got an Airbnb house, and we spent 2 days devoting our time to learning and being more skilled on how we can care for people. And when we say care for people, it's not just, hey, you have a shoulder to cry on. It's not just that, but it's empathizing with people, feeling with people, seeing their pain, seeing their celebration, and moving them towards sanctification, right? And so we're taking the time to unpack that. We're taking the time to learn and be deepened in that skill. And a big part of that is placing yourself in the other person's shoes and saying, help me to understand what you are going through. Not in a shallow way, but in a very deep and interpersonal way. Help me to understand what is it you're going through. And so if we can apply that kind of principle the best that we can, and we can go to these Israelites and say, Israelites, help me to step into your shoes. Help me to jump into this point of history, into your culture, into your people, and help me to see why it is that you're grumbling. Because it's easy for us to say, how dare they grumble against God, right? You're so selfish. You're such idiotic people. God just delivered you, and you're complaining. How dare you do that? But if we can kind of lay aside kind of get off our spiritual pedestals for a second, lay aside those things, and we know what truth is, but before we get to that truth, just be with the Israelites. In their struggle, in their emotions, whether their grumbling is justified or not, just to be with them and understand. Because what we're going to be able to eventually see is that, yes, they are disobedient and they are wicked and they are rebellious. Yes, these are things that we know. But if we think about context and background, I think we'll realize that the Israelites have only known slavery their whole lives. 400 years, we've established that. Do you know what that means? You look at them and you think, why can't you people just trust in God? What is it going to take for you to trust in God? Do you know why they can't trust in God? Because they don't know what trust looks like. They don't know what it's like to be in a covenant relationship with God. They don't know what it's like to be wicked, to be rebellious, to be depraved, and to be sinful, only for God to come to you and embrace you and cover you with His grace. They don't know that. They don't know what it's like to have God be your Redeemer. They don't know what it's like for God to have reestablished your identity from the soul. They don't know what it's like to sin against God, only for God to be faithful in your life. Do you know what happens when they were wicked against their ruler in Egypt? They were flogged and they were killed. That's what they understand. They don't know what it's like to have a king who genuinely loves you. They don't know what it's like to have a king to come to you and die for you. They don't know what trust looks like. Even if they wanted to trust God, they don't know what it looks like. And do you know why? It's because all they understand is the tyranny of Pharaoh. All they understand is that their identity is now slaves. How do you make a slave act like he's a free man? How do you teach a slave to be free? Do you think that's innate? You think that we know that from the day that we're born? What's innate in us is slavery, not freedom. And so here's a really important question to think about. God delivers them, they're in the wilderness, and they rebel, they actively rebel, and they grumble against God. And so how does God respond to the rebellion? I remember when I think I was 7 years old, and I went to the Cerritos Mall with my mom and my sister, and for us, we didn't grow up like super poor, but we never went to the mall. For me, it was Costco or it was the swap meet. I didn't know what the mall was. It was just big bunch of buildings. I never went inside, right? And so for me, the Cerritos Mall was like an amusement park. I'd never been there. Like, what's inside? And I remember some of my friends telling me, hey, man, check out these new Nikes I got at the Cerritos Mall. I was like, what is this mall you speak of? Is that a store? What is that? What is that? What is a mall? Costco? No, the mall. I was like, what is the mall? Right? And so finally we went to the mall. I was like, this place is magical. Right? And back when I was a child, the Cerritos Mall didn't have a food court. Yes, back in the day, right? Because I'm that old, right? But they didn't have a food court. It was just random restaurants in different spots. And I remember being really, really crowded. And so in my head, I'm assuming, when I think back on it, must have been the holidays because it was so crazy. It was crowded. And so we spent the whole day shopping, right? And I'm in this amusement park of a place, but we're getting tired, and we're getting hungry, and we're busy shopping, so we missed lunch. And so my mom finally says, we got to get something to eat. And so we go into Burger King, and I'm like, Burger King and the mall in one day? This is a life. And so we go to Burger King, and we get our food, and my mom tells me to hold the tray. I'm a 7-year-old, boy shaking with my tray because I desperately don't want to drop the food. And we're walking around trying to find a spot, but it's so busy that we can't. And it's just one of those awkward things. You're walking around the entire restaurant, Burger King of all places, and you're trying to find a spot, and then we can't. And so my mom's over there, and I'm kind of navigating with my sister. And so my mom finally gets our attention. She says, "Come here. I found a seat." We're like, "Where?" She's over there, and we're over here. I'm with my older sister, and my mom points to this old man. It's this old man sitting by himself in this big table. And for me, as a 7-year-old child, that was really, really weird. I don't want to go sit with some random old man, You know, how can I enjoy my food? How can I do that? And so I don't want to do that. My sister want to do that. But mom's telling us, come here, come here, come here, come here. And so I look at my sister, and she starts rolling her eyes. I'm like, oh, that's good. Oh, that's good. I look at her, I start rolling my eyes. I think it was the first time I rolled my eyes. I must have rolled my eyes like 20 times in like a minute. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. So much like, you know. And so I'm rolling my eyes, and then I look at my mom, and she says, come here now. And so we finally go, and we eat our food, and then we leave. Now, if you were my mom, what would you do? I mean, you don't know my mom, but if you were my mom, what would you do? Sit us down in a warm and loving way and say, you know, I don't appreciate you rolling your eyes at me. I feel disrespected. You shouldn't do that to your mother. I love you. Please don't do that again. That's not what happened. That's not what happened. We get into the car. 2 minutes in, I know something is up because she doesn't say anything. Mom, mommy, mom, amma, mom, nothing, right? And so immediately, if you grew up in my household, you know what that means. You're going to die. So we go home. She shuts the door, and she goes from this compassionate, loving, supportive mother to beast mode. And I swear, I think there are 2 horns that grew out of her head. And she whooped our butts. Man, it was a spanking of my life. I'll never forget what happened. It was like MMA champion. Like she just tore us up. Oh my gosh, I can't even explain. Now, there's a reason why I want to share that with you. You see, my mom doesn't tolerate rebellion. That's just my mom. No mom wants to be disrespected in public. No mom wants to have her children rebel against her. That's any mother, but my mom does not tolerate rebellion. And the reason I share that with you is because before we get into what actually God does and how God responds to the rebellion of the Israelites, is I want to point out something about God that we have to understand as God's people. The question is not just what did God actually do, the question is what could have God done? You just delivered your people out of your grace from bondage and slavery, and here they are grumbling about food and water and meat. What could have God done? Can you embrace the truth of what God could have done? Because it's easy to say, well, God can do anything and move on, but God can do anything. You realize that by God's word, he could rain down judgment and wipe his people out. And you think, well, God is loving and God is compassionate and God is full of mercy. God wouldn't do that. Are you sure about that? What do you think the flood was? You think that's a fake children's story? God murdered the world simply by the word of his command. Oh, well, that's Old Testament. You go to Acts, the New Testament. What do you think happened to a couple named Ananias and Sapphira when they lied to the Holy Spirit? God can wipe you out by simply the word of his mouth, and it's easy for God. What could have God done? God could have revived the Egyptian army, and he could have brought back his people under the enslavement, and he says, you want to grumble? I saved you. You want to grumble? Grumble about this. You're on your own. Go back to Pharaoh, go back to Egypt, and then grumble at me. That's what God could have done. And worse yet, you know what God could have done? God could have simply said, forget it, I'm done. And he could have abandoned his people and had them live on their own. You see, that is the worst kind of what God could have done. God could have done these things, but what does God actually do? Despite their grumbling, despite their rebellion, and despite their wickedness. He provides manna. He provides manna. Chapter 16, verse 16. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather it, each one of you, as much as he can eat. You shall each take an omer according to the number of the persons that each of you has in his tent. And the people of Israel did so. They gathered, some more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. Each of them gathered as much as he could eat. And Moses said to them, let no one leave any of it left over till the morning. But they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it till the morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning they gathered, and each as much as he could eat. But when the sun grew hot, and melted. So God provides manna, and here's what God is doing. He said, gather as much as you can eat, but don't save, don't try to invest, don't try to outsmart the system. Gather as much as you can eat for that day, and that is all. And if they wanted to save for the leftovers for the morning, just in case God didn't provide, it would just stank out and it would be really bad to eat. And so here's what God is doing. Think about what it's like for them, especially as farmers. Okay, we're not talking about modern business people. We're not talking about, engineers and politicians. We're talking about farmers. See, if you want food today, what do? You go buy food today. And that's it. And that's how easy it is. You go to the supermarket, you go to Starbucks, whatever it is, you buy whatever food, whatever you drink you want today. If you were one of them and you wanted to eat today, you had to plant crops seasons ago. You see, if you want food today, back then, you had to invest and you had to plant and you had to wait months and months and months, and then came the harvest season and you gathered as much as you possibly could, because it wasn't just about getting food, it was about survival. That's how they lived. And so what is God doing? He's coming down to their level as farmers. And he's challenging them in their paradigm, in their worldview of how to survive in this life. And he's saying, I need you to trust me today and not worry about tomorrow. You see, the best way I can just kind of parallel that to us is, what if God said, what does it look like for you to trust me? I'm going to give you a $15 paycheck today. And then I'm going to give you a $15 paycheck tomorrow. And the day after that and the day after that. You can't save anything left over. It's going to just disappear. It's going to be gone. Right? You try to starve yourself like junior high lunch, and you try to buy something nice later, right? You can't do that. $15 today, and that's it. That's all you need. Nothing more, nothing less. And it's not God saying, I'm going to give you $1 million. You could do what you want with it. You can invest in it, and you can accrue interest and all that. That's not what God is saying. Today and today only. $15. And he's challenging us. He's challenging us. He's coming down to our level, and he's saying, can you trust me today and not worry about tomorrow? That's what's happening here. And so think about how God now is sanctifying his people in the wilderness. Go to chapter 16, verse 22. And God moves on. Chapter 16, verse 22. And the sixth day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers each. And when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, this is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to be kept till the morning. So they laid it aside till the morning, as Moses commanded them, and it did not stink, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is the Sabbath, there will be none. So what is God doing? Because what is the big deal? What is so wrong with hard work and getting ahead? What is so wrong with having to save up and think about the future? Why is God so concerned about getting his people to take a day off and rest? Because, listen to this, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I will say this. One of the most practical and tangible ways of trusting in God is setting aside a day to rest. Because resting and not working causes you to say, I cannot save myself. God will provide. And even if it's not about saving, and even if it's not about providing for yourself, maybe you just want to feel good about yourself. Maybe you just want to feel justified in your hard work. Maybe you just want to work hard, and you can say, today I worked hard and I can reap my own benefits. But what is God saying? Your justification Your justification, your validation is in me. And so what God is saying through these things is, it's not what I give that you want. It's me that you want. It's not about going after the things that God provides. It's going to the provider. And I need you to think about that deeply. Do you go after things that God provides, or do you go after God himself? Because Old Testament stories are physical pictures of our spiritual condition. Because in the Red Sea, God miraculously split the water and saved his people. And then in John 6, Jesus walks on the water and he saves his disciples. In the wilderness, God miraculously feeds his people with manna. And then in John 6, Jesus miraculously feeds more than 5,000 people with bread and fish. In the wilderness, God is teaching his people to trust in his goodness and faithfulness. And in John 6, Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. Listen to me, church. Jesus is your manna in the wilderness. And if God is coming to us and he's pushing us into the wilderness, because this is our time of growth and learning and challenge and spiritual formation, what is God trying to get us to see? Jesus, our sustainer, our life giver. Will you trust that Jesus is enough for your sustenance? Will you trust that this manna is more than enough, not just for you to survive, but to thrive? And do you believe that it's not just what Jesus gives that you need, but it's Jesus himself? So here's what we need to think about. How is God calling you to trust him today? Let's not be ambiguous and vague about it and say, in the future and whatnot, whatever. Let's just think about today, or in this season, in this current normalities of life that you're in right now. How is God calling you to trust in him? What I want to talk about now, this is for everyone, but it's particularly for those of us who are leaders. And it's not just leaders at the church, but leaders in general. And when I say leaders, I mean particularly for us as covenant members, I mean pastors, I mean small group leaders, I mean Bible study teachers, I mean ministry leaders, any kind of leader. We're about a year and a half into our merge, and I know it's kind of crazy to think about. And I think for a lot of us, the first year was exciting because the church was new, people were new, programs were new, a lot of new things kind of getting launched, and just a lot of great energy. People just getting really willing to serve, to jump in and do things, and it's exciting. And that led to a bunch of people dating, which is awesome for the most part, And so what happens is once that kind of like 1 year mark passes, I think God starts deepening our idea of ministry, much like relationships. And much like relationships, it's like, hey, I made this new friend, we're homies, we're getting to know each other, and after some time, you get to know both their strengths and their weaknesses. You get to know both the things that you love and the things that you don't love as much, and then you start to say, I didn't know this relationship was going to be like this. And after about that 1 year mark, and we're kicking off and we're launching membership, a lot of us are just kind of serving and jumping into leadership positions, and we're saying the same thing. I didn't know serving was going to be like this. I didn't know leadership was going to be like this. And so a lot of things happen in that dynamic. You quickly realize that like people aren't what they seem when it comes to serving. You quickly realize that like leadership maybe is not as noble and glorious and good as you thought it was, because you begin to realize people show up not on time, and people show up not motivated, and people show up and they do a half-assed job, but it's ministry, it's not a job, and you can't say you're fired. And so how do I now like perform and produce good results but at the same time minister to people. And so what happens in that process and in that moment is you immediately have to rationalize something in your head, and you come to one of two conclusions. One, you say something is wrong with me. I think what has happened to many of us is that you decided that being a leader, or your expectation of a leader, is that you have to be well put together, you have to know the Bible, you have to know the theology, you just got to be this really well-seasoned and mature leader. And so something happens when things get difficult. Well, something must be wrong with me. I'm not qualified to be a leader. I'm inadequate to be a leader. Maybe I should step down. For my sake, for their sake, for the church's sake. Should I go talk to Pastor Howard? What is he going to say? Or two, you don't think that something is wrong with you. You think something is wrong with them. They're not excited to serve. They're not team players. They're difficult, and they need to get on board with me. And so church, live stream, leaders especially, I need you to listen not just with your head, but with your heart. Like many of you, God called Moses to be a leader, whether or not he was ready. Like many of you, Moses quickly discovered that leadership was overwhelming. Like many of you, Moses felt the burden and exhaustion of having to lead his people. Like many of you, Moses heard all the grumblings, he heard all the complaints, and it started to wear him down. Exodus chapter 15, verse 24, and the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" And he cried to the Lord. And he cried to the Lord. And the Lord showed him a log, and he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. There the Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and there he tested them. The reason I share this with you as a pastor, and the reason I appreciate what we just saw here, is because I have a particular burden for leaders. And if you've been in ministry long enough, you might have noticed that maybe I give a little bit more attention to certain EM leaders. And it's not because I'm trying to show favoritism. I just think they need it. I just think leaders need more attention, because it's one thing to be told what to do and you don't think about it and you do it. It's an entirely another thing to oversee people and have to make executive decisions. And when things go wrong, you're to blame. And so I want to be a kind of helper and a kind of sustainer for you leaders. And I want to be the kind of pastor that puts up hedges around you to protect you so that you can grow in a healthy environment. But as soon as the harsh realities kick in, it just bulldozes those hedges over, and you quickly realize that these are the realities of ministry. That it's hard, that it's overwhelming, and that people gossip, and people, they don't listen, and they're difficult to deal with, and it wears you down. And I begin to realize that I can't be your Savior. That my job as your pastor is I can't save you, I can't protect you. There's very little that I can do for you. And so I want you to be able to point you to some truth, and I want you to be able to look at Moses. And I want you to see Moses in reality. I want you to be able to shake his hand. Shake the hand of Moses, and I want you to feel the calluses on his hands. From holding that staff all day long, from having to split the Red Sea with that staff. And I want you to look at Moses' face, and I want you to see the wrinkles on his forehead and the wrinkles in his eyes from all that stress and all that prayer and all that burden. And I want you to see the tears in his eyes from not just the passion, but the hurt and the exhaustion. And I want you to connect with Moses. And I want you to hear Moses say, "I'm tired with you, and I get it, and I understand." And what we have to see from this is that Moses could not be a leader of his people until he was a follower of God. He cried to the Lord. And then we move with Moses in this progression, in this gospel progression. And we see Moses cry to the Lord. We see Moses depending on the Lord, even in sheer exhaustion, and even when he's burdened, and even when he's being worn down. Because when we go to the Lord, what do we see? We see the scars on Jesus' forehead because of the crown of thorns. And we see the marks in his hands and his feet from those nails being driven into his body. We see the scar on his side from the spear being thrusted. And we can hear Jesus telling us, I faced the heaviest burden of leadership so that you wouldn't have to. And because I have faced that burden, you can find rest for your soul and be sustained in my leadership over you. So hear me when I say this. Livestream leaders and Livestream members and visitors and friends, you cannot be a leader of God's people until you are first a follower of Christ. As soon as you go off into the wilderness, not months and years, we're talking hours into the dark wilderness, you will feel the burden of exhaustion. As soon as you wander away from the pillar of cloud and fire, you will see the darkness and you will feel it in your bones. But when you go to the manna and you see that it's enough for your soul, that it sustains you and it feeds you and it makes you thrive, how can we not go to Jesus? How can we not go to Jesus and cry? You see, crying to Jesus is different from complaining to Jesus and grumbling to Jesus. Grumbling to Jesus, saying, Jesus, I don't need you. Get out of my life. Crying to Jesus is saying, God, I need you more now than any time ever. Can we cry to Jesus? Can we depend on Jesus today, in this season? Can he be our functional manna today? Join me in prayer.